This video is going to be short and sweet. Section L, the continuing Cold War. So scientists urge that nuclear testing be stopped before the atmosphere became so polluted that, quote, it produced generations of deformed mutants. Okay, so we don't get any X-Men, right? So we don't pollute the atmosphere too much with these nuclear particles, what have you. Scientists say, hey, we need to stop testing all of these weapons, because although we're not using them against each other, we're exploding them, developing pollution. Okay, so in March of '58, the Soviets proclaimed a suspension in testing of nuclear weapons. And then in October of the same year, the United States stopped undergoing atmospheric and underground testing as well. So both sides say they're stopping these nuclear testings, preserving the environment, that sort of thing. But of course, we don't trust each other, so there's never really any inspections or regulations that actually happen. We both just say that we're stopping nuclear testing. Once again, tensions become very increased when Lebanon was threatened by Egypt, Lebanon being kind of Western-oriented, and Egypt, of course, being more on board with the Soviet Union. So when Lebanon was threatened by Egypt and other communist plottings, the U.S. called for aid to aid Lebanon under the Eisenhower Doctrine, right? Eisenhower Doctrine, kind of like the Truman Doctrine for the Middle East. So Lebanon is being threatened, so the U.S. comes to the aid of Lebanon. We land several thousand troops to restore order there, and fortunately this is without any loss of life. Okay. All right, so after this, Khrushchev, the guy in charge of the Soviet Union, he kind of wants to bolster his image internationally, so he calls for a summit conference. So after Lebanon, Khrushchev wants a summit conference, which means kind of the United States, the Soviet Union, and other countries kind of to meet together to talk, to chat, right? So Eisenhower's like, okay, let's start talking. So before the summit conference, which will happen in Paris, the United States, Eisenhower invites him to come to America. He goes before the UN, the Assembled United Nations, which is, of course, in New York City. And there he proclaims that he wants the complete disarmament of nuclear weapons. So it's one thing to say that, but he didn't propose any practical means in how we're going to disarm. He just says we ought to disarm. Okay. He's in the U.S., so he meets at the UN. He also meets at Camp David, which is kind of the presidential retreat in Maryland. So he meets Eisenhower at Camp David, and people are very hopeful that this summit that's coming up in Paris will be successful. So he meets Eisenhower at Camp David. Yeah, all of this good stuff. So things are looking good. People are hoping that there's going to be a spirit of Camp David, a spirit of this peace or the summit in Paris, but that doesn't happen because we'll see the Paris summit conference will be a complete fiasco because right before everyone's supposed to meet in Paris for this summit conference, a United States spy plane, right, a U-2 plane, was shot down over Russia. So it doesn't really lend to a lot of trust when the Soviet Union shoots down a spy plane over their country. So now that they know the United States is spying on the Soviet Union, the peace conference was kind of, I shouldn't say peace conference, but the Paris summit conference was over before it started. Nothing got done because of this kind of bad blood formed when that U-2 plane was shot down. And also, at the conference, neither side was willing to budge on this Berlin issue. We see the city of Berlin, right, the capital of Germany, had been divided into different sections, and it's growing more and more apart. So Berlin is being divided further and further and further. So no one was really willing to budge. So nothing really comes out of this summit. Well, anyway, Section M, Cuba's Castroism spells communism. So Castroism meaning Castro. Okay, so we'll talk about kind of Cuba becoming communists, or in line with the Soviet Union at least. So Latin America was growing more and more upset with the United States because after the war, once again, we started to kind of interfere with their business. And plus, we're spending billions to help rebuild, Europe through the Marshall Plan, but we weren't willing to spend close to that in these Latin American countries who really needed help as well. So there's some bad blood there. U.S. habit of interfering, for example, in Latin America, the CIA, once again, created a coup that got rid of a leftist-leaning government in Guatemala. So we see the CIA is just thrown over, we threw over the leader of Iran, now we're throwing over the leader of Guatemala. So anyway, in the 1930s, Cuba had been under control of Baptista, B-A-T-I-S-T-A, Baptista. And really, he was really kind of pro-American. He really encouraged U.S. investments in Cuba. So U.S. invested a lot of money in Cuba, sunk a lot of money into Cuba. However, in 1959, 30 years later, more or less, Fidel Castro kind of creates a revolution that ousts Baptista. Okay, and when he comes to power, Castro, he denounces America as this Yankee imperialist. So he's definitely not a pro-American sort of guy. So in response to this revolution, the U.S. In turn cuts off all U.S. imports of Cuban sugar. So we're not going to buy their sugar. Take that. Don't mess with America. So in response to us cutting off their importing sugars and no longer trading, no longer buying their sugar, Fidel Castro starts this practice of nationalizing U.S.-owned businesses, things to that nature, American property, that sort of thing. Now, because Castro is kind of taking over all of these American businesses, America responds by placing a complete embargo on Cuba, which is still there today. So we're not trading with Cuba at all, right? That's why Cuban cigars are so awesome, because you're not supposed to have them, right? They're illegal. They're from Cuba. Ooh. Okay. Anyway, but the Soviet Union kind of adopts Cuba. The Soviet Union's more than thrilled that they have their new little, communist friend 90 miles off the coast of the United States. So the Soviet Union turns to the United States, more or less says, we will shower missiles on you if you attack our new little friend. So we see the Soviet Union and Cuba kind of becoming buddies at this time as well, once Fidel Castro takes over in 59. Section N, Kennedy challenges Nixon for the presidency. So we're talking about the election of 1960. So we're getting to the 60s. The 1960 election, Nixon, who had been VP under Eisenhower, was the clear choice or at least the logical choice for the Republicans. So the Republicans nominate him without too much show, okay? He had gained more popularity. Of course, he had always been kind of this hard on communism guy, but he even grew more popular through something called the kitchen debate. And what this was a highly publicized debate Nixon actually had with the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev. And what this was is kind of like, it was in Moscow, and it was kind of like Nixon was debating the pros of capitalism versus Khrushchev and the pros of communism. So he became very famous through this debate. He's Nixon, right? He's famous. Get over it. Okay. But then for the Democrats, it was kind of a free-for-all. There was no really forerunner. And really, we see kind of rising to the top two candidates. JFK, whose actual name is, of course, John F. Kennedy. He's a young millionaire senator from Massachusetts, World War II veteran, and really his closest competition for the Democratic nomination was the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon B. Johnson. So they were both kind of who's going to win. After time, it became clear that JFK was winning more primaries than Lyndon B. Johnson, so they kind of had a marriage of convenience. So JFK had Johnson become his vice presidential or his running mate on the ticket for the Democratic Party. And the thing is, these guys never really got along at all. Johnson was a Senate Majority Leader, and when he became Vice President, it was kind of like him taking a step down. He actually kind of lost power because of the Vice Presidency. So they didn't really get along well. Kennedy barely ever really referred to Johnson for anything, but it was a marriage of convenience, right? JFK wanted kind of someone who would draw in those Southern votes. Johnson had been a senator from, I think, Texas, so Johnson kind of helped get Kennedy some votes because he was from the South, and then Kennedy kind of lost his main competition for the presidency, so they kind of worked together there. And as they were running, what John F. Kennedy was calling for during this election was the new frontier, which when he wins election will be his policy in America, the new frontier. The problem was, for Kennedy, he was really handicapped by the fact that he was Catholic, politically speaking. And, people were saying a vote for Kennedy is a vote for the Pope. If you vote for Kennedy, the Pope will be controlling the White House. Kennedy responded by pointing to the 13 years of service he'd given as a U.S. congressman, and also saying, just because, it's are you going to now, because I'm Catholic, make all Catholics across America, the 40 million Catholics in America, second-class citizens, that sort of thing. So really, typically this was kind of a tough one for the South, especially the Bible Belt, because typically the Bible Belt in the South were pro-Democratic Party. However, a lot of them just couldn't swallow the pill of having a Catholic in the White House. So JFK kind of lost some votes he probably would have gained in the South because he was a Catholic. But on the flip side, because he was Catholic, he also gained some votes, especially among the former immigrants of the world, right? The Germans, especially those in like industrial centers, their parents or their grandparents had been immigrants. They were Catholic after all as well. So we see Kennedy losing some votes because he was Catholic, but also gaining some more votes because he's Catholic. So it kind of balances itself out, but it's definitely an issue in the campaign. Okay, and probably the thing that really helped tip the scale when it came to who's going to win, Nixon or Kennedy, is really the television. Okay, so they have 4 televised debates during this 1960 campaign. And really, the thing is, when people were listening to these debates on the radio, a lot of them would say maybe Nixon won. But when you watched it on TV, most people would say Kennedy won. And most people had TVs, so they were watching them on TV. About 60 million people watched it as opposed to listening to it. And they saw Kennedy, of course, he's very young, kind of glamorous, very full of life. And they saw Nixon, looking tired, kind of had a 5 o'clock shadow going on, that sort of thing. So it really helped tip the scales in favor of Kennedy. And we'll see Kennedy win 303 to 219 to Nixon. But really, it was really close when you look at the popular count. Not the electoral count, which I just gave you, but really it was a close call when it came to the popular votes. In fact, Kennedy only got about 118,000 more votes than Nixon. But nonetheless, Kennedy becomes president, the first Catholic and the youngest elected ever. And once again, his support comes from those industrial centers where a lot of former immigrants will vote for him, and also in the African American community, because we'll see the Democratic Party really take the civil rights movement as their own, sort of speak. And also in this election, Democrats gain a slight majority in both House and the Senate. So Democrats, this is definitely a victory for them in 1960. Section O, an old general fades away. So this is talking about the old general being Eisenhower. So Eisenhower continued to be massively popular, even kind of at the final curtains of his presidency. We see the 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951, limiting the presidential term officially to 2 terms. So the idea before, everyone following the example of George Washington had kind of had that tradition of 2 terms of the presidency. Of course, FDR kind of breaking that tradition. But they decided in 1951 to pass an amendment making this an official thing. So it's really easy to remember this, right? So 2 terms, 22nd Amendment, right? That's like all of them are 2s. 22nd, so 2 terms. Amendments. Yay! Okay, so because of this, there was never any question of like, is Eisenhower going to run again? That sort of thing. But instead of becoming a lame duck, he's really actually quite active in the last year of his term. For example, we see Alaska and Hawaii are going to become a state in 59, making us 50 states strong. Just in this section just kind of talks about his legacy. Although he was not a crusader for the civil rights movement, he also wasn't like a bigot. They said, he did reject some New Deal programs, but he also accepted some New Deal programs. And by Eisenhower kind of putting his stamp of approval on these New Deal programs like Social Security, that sort of thing, he really weaves these permanently into the fabric of America. So it's really Eisenhower's stamp of approval that we still have Social Security today, for example. We see him, of course, in the foreign policies, kind of walk our way through a lot of very sticky situations. And when all is said and done, really, his popularity only grew after he left the presidency. So through the rest of his life, Eisenhower's popularity is just there. It's not going nowhere. It's just even growing, if anything else. Okay, section P, the life of the mind in post-war America. So this is like a little baby culture section. So there's some terms, some books, some poets, that sort of thing. So the ones I'm highlighting are literally the ones that I've heard of before. Okay, so there's a lot of them listed, but these are like the bigger ones, right? So in literature, we have 2 Nobel Prize winners. We have Ernest Hemingway, which is who he's known for The Old Man and the Sea, among many other things. He and actually quite a few of the writers that come out of this era will actually end up killing themselves. He's an example of this. In 1961, he shoots himself. John Steinbeck, Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden, also Nobel Prize winner, Go America. And the difference is, after World War I, we had this increase, this huge flood of materials written about World War I. It was a lot of inspiration to a lot of material, a lot of realism after World War I. However, World War II is different. It really doesn't inspire that realism that World War I did. There is a lot written about World War II, or literature that was inspired by World War II, but it was less realistic. It was more like fantasy, that sort of thing. Yes, the inspiration was World War II, but it wasn't like my story of the trenches. It was more of like a fantasy twist to the World War II literature. Okay, poetry. We have some playwrights, I should say. Playwrights Tennessee Williams, hugely successful, very famous. Tennessee Williams, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, A Streetcar Named Desire. We have Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman, and The Crucible. All of these you've probably heard of before, or will hear of at one point or the other, especially because I just mentioned it. In the South, we have people like William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor. We have the very famous Jewish writer S.D. Salinger writing The Catcher in the Rye. And just a lot of good artists coming out of this era, I suppose you can say. Well, with that, we are done with chapter 37. We'll see you next chapter.